We're going to look at Milton's second epic this morning, Milton's Paradise Regained, and we're going to conclude our study of Paradise Lost, his first major poem. And I want to talk a little bit about the timeline of historical timeline falling between the two works. And also some of the context for us to understand and appreciate Paradise Regained, which is a very different work than that of Paradise Lost. But in terms of the timeline, let me begin by saying that Paradise Lost was first published in 1667 in 10 books and was revised so that it appeared 7 years later in 1674 in the form of 12 books, and the 12 books, I spoke to this a little bit already in our class, thereby dealing with as much with Renaissance ideas versus, to some degree, of number and the importance of number in deciding on 12 as opposed to 10, as opposed to Pythagorean ideas of number. And so when he does this, he writes it to fall within the understanding of the epic that really Virgil's Aeneid puts forth as in a 12-book epic. By the time he writes Paradise Regained, as I say, the original publication of Paradise Lost is 1667. The two books that we're going to look at to conclude the course, Paradise Regained and Samson Agonistes, appear together, and they're published in one volume 4 years after Paradise Lost is published. In 1671, Paradise Regained is published. It's published as a brief epic, and it is then closely followed by Samson Agonistes, which is a dramatic play, although it's a closet drama, and I'll talk about that. In terms of the genesis of these works, as we've already noted, Milton was blind. One of the stories of the Genesis comes from a Quaker by the name of Thomas Elwood, who read to Milton and was also tutored by Milton. And Elwood's account is that Milton gave him the manuscript of Paradise Lost to study, and then when he returned it to Milton, Elwood said to him, "Thou hast said much here of Paradise Lost, but what hast thou to say of Paradise Found?" Well, I think Milton has already dealt with that issue myself in Paradise Lost, and we've already talked about that. But we show Milton records that in the manuscript of the brief epic, he remarks, and this is Elwood's recounting. Scholars have questioned whether this is accurate or not, but he says, Milton says to Elwood, "This is owing to you, for you put it into my head by the question you put to me at Chalfont," where they originally spoke, "which before I had not thought of." Now, this is Elwood's only Elwood's private conversation, not related anywhere else. As I say, scholars question whether this actually took place. The context of the brief epic and the form of the brief epic, it may go back to the book of Job. And if you look at the book of Job, the character of Job is tempted by Satan to give up his faith in God. And he does so with the explicit agreement of God that he should be allowed to do this within certain limitations. And we see that Job is receiving increasing adversity in his life as Satan continues to tempt him and put him up for trials. Milton, to some degree, seems to me in this brief epic is leaning on that book of Job, which many have found to be a masterpiece of literature. I myself see that it is so in some ways. But Milton dovetails that account of Job with the account of the temptation in the wilderness, which we see both in Matthew and also in Luke's account. And what Milton dramatizes is Jesus' Christian heroism. So the accounts in Luke just for those who are watching, Luke 4, verses 1 to 13, or Matthew 4, verses 1 to 11. So these are an account of three temptations. And the three temptations, furthermore, have very specific features. And I'm going to get into those features in a minute. But as I say, I wanted to do something more of a historical contextualization of what's happened, because recall, in 1660, by this point, the Republic has fallen. And Charles I, or Charles II rather, has been invited back to much acclaim by the people of England. Some seeing it as an answer to prayer, others as a sign of God's will, etc. So 11 years have fallen between that time and the time that Milton is writing Paradise Regained. And Charles II has now been installed or restored to the place of monarchy. And Milton is lying under some form of house arrest, having escaped the possibility of being executed for his role in the death of Charles I. Of course, he had not been a signatory or so forth, so he escaped largely because of some influential friends, including perhaps his brother, but certainly that of Andrew Marvell. Interceded and said, leave him alone. And because of that, we have these three major works of Milton's, as well as a few prose treatises, which are less acclaimed, and probably rightly so, but I'll get to that perhaps in a minute. But we've now had over a decade of Charles II's reign, and there's what we see in this is a diehard Republican in the form of Mr. Milton, now writing with his idea of a republic in ruins. How does he relate then, politically and otherwise, to the theme of a republic vis-a-vis the claims of a monarch? Well, there are two things, or three things really, which I think are contextual here, which we need to draw to our attention. And these are bills that we can see before the House of Commons, bills in 1670. Presented before the House. One, a subsidy bill. Two, a bill to regulate conventicles, which are the private meeting of nonconformists, those that are not members of the Church of England. So there's a bill to regulate their meetings. And finally, there is a divorce bill. Put forward the so-called Lord Roos divorce bill, ROOS. And each of these bills, I think, gives some insight into what Milton is talking about and writing about in the backdrop of these two major poems, Paradise Regained and Samson Agonistes. And what they illustrate is the decline in character of the English Commonwealth under Charles II, and largely the connection of that with the loss of virtue. And Milton will, I think, illustrate in Paradise Regained. So book 4, lines 143 to 145, he will say, or at least the Son of God will denounce the captive tribes of Israel, saying this. Book 3, verses 431 to 42. Let them serve their enemies who serve idols with God. And he also condemns the Romans and says this: what wise and valiant man would seek to free these thus degenerate, by themselves enslaved, or could of inward slaves make outward free? In reference to the Romans. That's, as I say, book 4, 143 to 145. These are these words, which are directed, at least apparently, at the nation of Israel and at the Romans, could also be applied to Milton's contemporaries, because Milton understood that the context for a republic would be a virtuous people. There can be no republic in Milton's eyes that will sustain itself without virtue. And without virtue, a a republic invariably inclines, or declines rather, into tyranny. And so in his second defense of the Commonwealth to a European audience, Milton writes about the importance of character, of a people, virtuous character, in order to retain liberty. And he says this: unless you expel avarice, ambition, and luxury from your minds, yes, and extravagance from your families as well, you will find at home and within that tyrant who you believed was to be sought abroad and in the field, now even more stubborn. And he appeals, when he says this, to the Romans, who learned this the hard way through in the late Republic, and draws upon many writings there. And so Milton's republicanism is not simply a matter of power or spreading out power from a monarch to a larger group of aristocrats, of extending the franchise to be involved in government to a larger body of individuals. It's not just simply about many, or at least a few, as opposed to one. It's more about the role of virtue in governing the republic. And so Milton's clear understanding, which is clear, and not only here in this work, but also all that goes all the way back to his early poems, which I emphasize in this as well, is that there can be no freedom without virtue. And virtue is tied to obedience to the will of God as it's expressed in his word. Milton is consistent in this everywhere. Also in relation to free speech, his tractate Areopagitica does defend free speech and the publication of works, but of course it does so because truth will vanquish its enemies on the field of battle, yes, but having been presented in public, works that were deleterious to the public good and were explicitly either sinful or undermined the public good, Milton allowed those to be censored after the fact, just simply not before the fact. They deserved to at least receive a free hearing. So this connection between virtue amongst a people and freedom is very strong in Milton, and it's consistently presented throughout. And note again, Adam himself fell because he chose in accordance with his lusts. And his wife did. She followed the tempter rather than obeying, and so she lost her freedom in the process. So she followed the words of the devil, but also the temptations of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and so forth. Milton is going to revisit those themes here in Paradise Regained. And what he effectively does in Paradise Lost is, as he announces right at the outset, of man's first disobedience, paradise is lost. In Paradise Regained, it's of man's obedience that he will regain the paradise. So there's a symmetry to the two works. And he even says this in Paradise Lost, till one greater man restore them. Well, how will he restore them? Well, he will restore them through obedience. And that is exactly what is at stake here in Paradise Regained, is in the temptation in the wilderness, the obedience of Messiah, Jesus, in the face of the temptations that he receives at the hands of Satan in the wilderness, are the very things that restore paradise in Milton's mind and understanding. But back to these three bills, which I think are important and deserve a little bit of attention here. Let's look at these first of all, and these three bills. So what are these three bills? Well, in the first one I mentioned, the bill of subsidy. What's that all about? Well, the bill of subsidy is a way of gaining money. Charles II requires funds in order to govern, and govern in the way that he would like to govern. And in general, I don't think Charles II was a particularly doctrinaire man, and we'll come to see why I say that in a second, but not particularly concerned with that. with issues of doctrine per se, although he was Anglican and leaned towards Catholicism. That will become clear. The reasons for which I say that will become clear in a second. But the king wanted money and subsidies, as I say, and related to that, let's see here. I'm getting my context here from an article here by Laura Lunger Knoppers. It's Knoppers. This bill is there, first of all, to supply him. And it gives a window into the conflict of the period between the Parliament and the monarch, which continued even after the Restoration. And Charles wanted and got his subsidies for his extravagant expenditures. But it's in the and he disliked strongly the concessions he needed to give to Parliament in order to receive this money. But it's the purse that it was the subject of debate here. But in the sum of money that was requested here, there was money. I'll just deal with the second bill. The second bill, which was called, what was it called? The no, the first bill. Sorry, in the first bill, Charles had an alliance or a pledge to align his kingdom with France against the Dutch in return for a French subsidy. The Dutch were Calvinists. They were clearly in the Protestant camp, and Charles agreed to work in alignment with the French king being Catholic, against the Dutch, if they would give him money. Okay, so this is problematic enough, but there are also secret provisions, and these secret provisions, which were little known at the time, but available now in documents in the Secret Treaty of Dover in 1668 to 1670, the king and his two top ministers, Arlington and Clifford, he promised, Charles did, to convert publicly to Catholicism and to reconcile the three kingdoms of Britain to Rome. And in return, Louis XIV would provide further subsidies and, if necessary, French troops on English soil to put down any dissent that might occur. So this is a secret commitment to the Secret Treaty of Dover, and this influenced the remainder of his reign. So there's not only an alignment towards Catholicism, but a public, or a commitment to publicly present himself as a Catholic. Now you can see, given that fact, given what was fought about in the previous war, the English Civil War, that this would obviously create a great deal of animosity and tension, and indeed it did. Now, Parliament forced Charles to withdraw from that declaration, but also passed a test that all office holders in England deny publicly transubstantiation and make an Anglican commitment, take Anglican communion at least once per year. So they're pushing him to, at the very least, be an Anglican, as he was. He was, in fact, the head of the Church of England. Whereas his brother, the very popular Duke of York, probably was Catholic secretly. And this was obviously an issue for that. Having said that, the Conventicle Act, which I mentioned as the second issue, was put in there to restrain religious liberty for those who are nonconformists. Now, who are the nonconformists? Well, nonconformists would include Catholics, but it would also probably particularly relate to those who are Quakers and Anabaptists and so forth. These would have been affected directly by the Conventicle Act, and what was in view with the Conventicle Act was fines, stiff fines for dissenting and preaching in a dissenting fashion, and they would do so, as I say, on private lands, and landowners would allow them their lands in order to do this. what was added to this was an incentive to people to betray these landlords, that they were allowing this to happen. So informers were given financial incentives to inform on their fellow countrymen. So this obviously created also significant hostility and animosity there. Finally, there was the divorce bill, Lord Roos's bill, which was to divorce an unfaithful wife and remarry. At the time, this was strictly forbidden, as Milton himself wrote a tract on divorce. But all the same, there was a strong resistance to that tendency. But the contemporaries of Milton, particularly with Lord Roos's bill in mind, saw this as a way for Charles II to divorce his wife, who had not borne him an heir. And Gilbert Burnet, who was the Bishop of Salisbury at the time, the chaplain to Charles II, and later was a historian, writes that, quote, "The Duke of York, Charles II's brother, and all his party apprehended the consequences of a parliamentary divorce. So they opposed this with great heat, and the king was as earnest in the setting it on as the Duke was in opposing it." And Burnet adds that after the bill had passed, some moved the king, that he would order a bill to be brought in to divorce him from the queen. But he didn't, actually, in the end. Charles II did not do that. But instead, he pursued a whole series of mistresses, both French and English, pursued court beauties, and everyone from English actresses to French ladies in waiting. So Charles II was not well known for his chastity. So rather than divorcing his wife, he just proceeded to involve himself with a series of women, and some suggested men. I'll leave that comment aside, lack of evidence on that, but there were all sorts of scandalous suggestions about Charles II at the time. So given all of that, and Milton's views on virtue and the necessity of virtue for having a republic, Milton is not so concerned with attacking Charles II. What he is concerned with is critiquing his fellow countrymen for having lost a republic, and the reasons for that. And those are in line and mentioned implicitly, or even in a few places, perhaps you could see explicitly, in Paradise Regained, and to some degree in Samson Agonistes. But let me go now to the general themes and the context for Paradise Regained that I think we need to attend to here. Paradise Regained, as I say, is embellishing upon the account of the temptation in the wilderness in Luke 4 and Matthew 4. It's a brief epic, again, following in the footsteps of the book of Job. So very interestingly, Milton moves away from the classical model of the epic, which he's followed in book 12, and moves more towards the biblical epic, which we see in the book of Job, in his latter epic, and in it believes that he is going to prove what was in question before, that paradise had been regained. And he does it, and I mentioned this to you last time, perhaps surprisingly, not in the form of the incarnation. So paradise is not regained when the woman's seed is born, which is the way one could read it, at least perhaps in Revelation 12, when the woman gives birth to a child. Or you could see it, Paradise Regained, in the crucifixion on Good Friday and his ascension from the dead on Easter Sunday. That could be Paradise Regained at that point. Or you could finally perhaps see it in the ascension of the Son, a return to his Father's side in the ascension, in which case he would be king, or Lord over all creation. Those things could be, I think, fit subject matter for Paradise Regained, and one would have thought one of those three scenes might be the subject matter, but they're not. The subject matter that Milton chooses is the temptation in the wilderness, which is, in one sense, highly unexpected and puzzling. But in another sense, it does follow very closely Milton's general themes of the connection of obedience to freedom. Strong emphasis on those two things in alliance with one another. There can be no freedom without obedience to the will of God. That is so strongly emphasized here that Milton makes it the very central dramatic ground here for the entire shorter epic. I think we can say that in that there are three issues, three aspects of Christ being emphasized here. And this is the Calvinist view of Jesus' identity. Jesus is our prophet, he is our priest, and he is our king. And I'll take them in the order of that Milton presents them in terms of the three temptations in the wilderness. He's our prophet, he is our king, and he is our priest. He is our prophet in the sense that he is, as scripture says, he is the faithful witness. He is our king in the sense that he's the ruler of kings on earth, as it says in Psalm 2. And he is our priest insofar as he is the firstborn of the dead. So the threefold office of Christ, the munus triplex, is being illustrated here in these three temptations in the wilderness. And in these three temptations in the wilderness, there are three different types of temptation that are being presented. And I think the key verse for this is in 1 John 2, verse 16. I'd encourage you to look at that, where John writes, do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And now I quote the verse. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life is not from the Father, but from the world. But those three things, the desires of the flesh, first temptation, the desires of the eyes, second temptation, the pride of life, third temptation. These are what are being illustrated in this encounter between the Son of God and the devil in the temptation in the wilderness. Now, the first one in Latin is called the concupiscentia carnis, that of hunger. The second, and it relates to his role as prophet. And the distinction between truth and falsehood. We'll look at this in more detail next time when we look at Book 1 of Paradise Regained. But his role as prophet is in view here, and we'll, lines 294 to 502 is where this distinction between truth and falsehood, what constitutes true bread, that is what is being concerned here. But the distinction between truth and falsehood is about the lust of the flesh, or the desires of the flesh. The second temptation, the concupiscentia oculorum, the lust of the eyes, or of the world or kingdoms, explores Christ's role as king. We'll find that in Book 2, lines 302, all the way into Book 4, line 393. So a large, extended passage in which we are looking at the second temptation. And there are an extended series of assaults on Christ's virtues, his virtues of temperance, his contentment, his magnanimity, his modesty. There's a whole series of temptations that come forth in terms of the desires of the eyes. So the second temptation it takes a great deal of the shorter epic here. The third temptation, the pride of life, is when the devil, who is presented as a tower, in that temptation, Christ presents his role as priest. And this is the pride of life. And there's a great deal of imagery of the passion, fortitude, patience, and finally, he's revealed in his identity as the Son of God, God the Son. all sorts of temptations being presented there. But these three temptations, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, which correspond to the threefold office of Christ as prophet, king, and priest, respectively, that is the subject matter of these opening three or of the three temptations in Paradise Regained. I will get into these in greater detail when we look at book 1 next time, and we will primarily, as I said, look at the first temptation, the lust of the flesh. That will be the subject matter, and we'll get into that though when we meet again next time. That's it for now.